All right, ready to dive deep into the world of S&P US indices.
Let's do it.
We're going behind the scenes, cracking open the official methodology document, folks. It's going to be way more interesting than it sounds, I promise. We're talking about how these benchmarks are actually built, the stuff most people never even think about.
Yeah, it's like we're about to uncover the secret recipe for these indices. Everyone knows the S&P 500, right?
Right.
But how many people actually understand what goes into it? The intricate process of picking companies, the calculations.
Exactly. And that's what we're here for. We're going deep into methodology-sp-us-indices.pdf. Get ready to drop some serious index knowledge at your next cocktail party.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll be seeing the market through a whole new lens, understanding how these benchmarks shape our view of the stock market's ups and downs. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
So first things first, let's zoom out and get the big picture. The source tells us S&P US indices are all about tracking the performance of US companies, which, on the surface, seems pretty straightforward.
Sure, sounds simple enough.
But there's a whole family of these indices, each with its own unique focus.
It's not just one giant list. Think of it like a diverse ecosystem of indices, each one tailored to represent a specific part of the U.S. stock market.
Oh, I like that. An ecosystem.
Yeah, you've got indices for the big players, the large companies, then others for mid-sized companies, even ones for the small-cap companies. And then you've got indices that zero in on specific sectors like energy or healthcare. It's quite a variety.
So it's like a choose-your-own-adventure for tracking the market, basically. And most of these indices, they use this thing called float-adjusted market capitalization, or FMC, for weighting.
FMC.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sounds complicated, but we'll break it down later.
Promise.
It's key to understanding how much sway each company has on the index's overall performance. A bigger FMC means a company's stock price moves will have a bigger impact, right? It's all about proportion and influence.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's meet some of the stars of this index family. We've got the famous S&P 500, which a lot of people see as a stand-in for the entire U.S. stock market, even though it only has, 500 companies.
Right, the S&P 500. It's often seen as a bellwether for the U.S. economy. When it's up, investors are generally feeling good about the future, but it's important to remember it's only showing us part of the picture, mainly the large-cap companies.
Got it. So then you've got the S&P Mid-Cap 400 and the Small-Cap 600 focusing on mid-size and smaller companies, respectively. And then there's the S&P Total Market Index, which sounds pretty all-encompassing.
Yeah, the Total Market Index. That one aims to capture the performance of the entire U.S. stock market, including all eligible U.S. common stocks. As broad a view as you can get.
Everyone's invited to that party. Now, get this. There's also an index called the Completion Index. Sounds kind of mysterious, almost like the opposite of the S&P 500.
Yeah, the Completion Index. It's pretty cool, actually. It includes all the companies in the S&P Total Market Index, except the ones in the S&P 500. So it's a way to track what the rest of the market is doing, the companies that don't make it into the big leagues but are still important.
Interesting. And then there are some with names that sound like they're straight out of a board game, like Top 10, Top 20, and Top 50. I'm picturing a stock market version of Monopoly.
I see what you mean. Those top indices, they track the performance of the largest companies in the S&P 500. So it's like a super concentrated view of those giants, watching the titans of industry go head to head.
Okay, so we've met the indices. Now let's talk about how companies actually get chosen for these exclusive clubs. It's not as easy as just picking the biggest names or the most well-known companies, is it?
Not at all. There's a whole set of rules, eligibility criteria that companies have to meet to even be considered for an S&P US index. These rules are there to make sure the indices accurately reflect their target markets and that they're actually, investable.
So it's not just about being famous. It's about meeting specific standards to ensure the index is a reliable and meaningful benchmark. And the document mentions some pretty strict rules about where a company trades. No shady back alley stock exchanges allowed, huh?
Exactly. The company's stock has to be listed on a recognized U.S. stock exchange. And they also have to meet certain requirements about their structure. For example, SPACs, those special purpose acquisition companies that have been all the rage lately, generally, they're not eligible. They need to be a certain type of company with a solid track record.
Right, that makes sense. You wouldn't want an index full of companies that are difficult to invest in or, might disappear overnight. It wouldn't be a very reliable benchmark then. But here's something that caught my eye. A company can have multiple share classes, and each one is evaluated separately. So one share class could be in an index, while another one from the same company is left out. That's kind of wild.
It is. And then you get into tracking stocks, which represent a specific part of a company's business. Some indices, like the total market index, allow tracking stocks. Others, like the composite 1500, don't. It can get pretty complex.
So there's a lot of nuance to these eligibility rules. It's not just a simple yes or no.
Right.
It really highlights how carefully these indices are put together. And all this attention to detail, it's ultimately for the investor, right? It means the index performance reflects companies you could actually invest in, companies that meet certain standards of, I guess, quality and stability.
Exactly. The takeaway here is that these aren't just random groups of companies. They're thoughtfully curated portfolios designed to represent specific parts of the market.
Okay, so we've talked about where companies trade, their structure, but what about their size? Does that matter? I mean, it's got to play a role, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Market capitalization, or market cap, that's key for index eligibility. It boils down to how much a company is worth based on its stock price and how many shares are out there.
Right, market cap. So bigger the company, more likely it is to be in an index.
Well, it depends on the index, actually. Like the S&P Total Market Index. No minimum market cap. It's all about inclusivity there. But for others, like the Composite 1500 and its parts, the S&P 500, Mid Cap 400, and Small Cap 600, there are specific market cap ranges. Got to make sure the index accurately reflects its target.
So the S&P 500, which everyone thinks of as the benchmark for large cap stocks, actually has a minimum market cap requirement. That makes sense. But what happens if a company's market cap changes over time? Do they get kicked out of the index if they shrink too much?
That's a great question, and it shows how dynamic these indices really are. Those market cap ranges for the Composite 1500 and the others, they're actually updated every quarter. The market's always changing, so the indices have to keep up.
Wow, so it's like a constant game of musical chairs with companies moving in and out of these indices based on their market cap?
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes following these indices so interesting. They're not just static. They're constantly evolving to mirror the market.
So we've got where companies trade, their structure, their market cap. Anything else that comes into play when deciding who makes the cut? Is there like a secret handshake or something?
Haha, well, maybe not a secret handshake. But there's one more big factor. Financial viability.
Financial viability. Okay, makes sense. You wouldn't want an index full of companies that are about to go bankrupt. Talk about a bad investment.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. Remember how we said the S&P Total Market Index tries to be as inclusive as possible? Well, it actually doesn't have any financial viability requirements.
Wait, seriously? They'll include companies that are like struggling financially? Isn't that a bit risky?
It might seem that way. But remember, the Total Market Index is designed to be a snapshot of the entire market, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So while no financial viability requirements might add a bit of risk, it also makes it a more complete and unbiased picture of the market.
So it's a trade-off. More inclusive, but potentially riskier.
Gotcha. What about the other indices, though? Are they a bit more selective? Oh, yeah. The Composite 1500 indices, including the S&P 500, they definitely want to see some positive earnings. They want to make sure the companies they include are in good shape. Think of them as representative of the investable universe of stocks, the ones you'd actually want to put your money in.
So there's an index for everyone, basically. Depends on your risk tolerance and how you like to invest. But another question popped into my head. Are there ever any exceptions to these rules? Can a company sneak in even if it doesn't tick all the boxes?
There are exceptions, but they're rare. The document mentions the index committee has the power to make exceptions in certain situations. They're kind of like the referees, making sure everything's fair and the rules are applied properly.
Ah, the mysterious index committee. We'll definitely have to talk more about them later. But for now, can you give me an example of a situation where they might make an exception?
Sure. Imagine a company that's not in the Composite 1500 acquires a company that is in the index. Let's say the acquiring company doesn't quite meet all the criteria on its own. The index committee might decide to add it anyway just to make sure the index still accurately reflects the market after the acquisition.
So they're trying to maintain the integrity of the index even when things get a little messy in the real world. It's like they're constantly adjusting the recipe to make sure the cake still tastes good, even if some of the ingredients have changed.
I like that analogy.
What other exceptions are there?
Spin-offs are another interesting one. Sometimes a company spins off part of its business into a separate entity, and that spin-off might be allowed to stay in the parent company's index, even if it wouldn't normally qualify in its own. This usually happens when the spin-off is big enough to still be considered a part of the parent's market. Again, it's all about making sure the index stays true to its purpose.
So There's a human element to all this. It's not just a set of rigid rules blindly applied. The index committee steps in to make judgment calls when necessary. That's actually quite reassuring, isn't it?
It is. It means there's some oversight, some flexibility built in, which helps keep those indices reliable and relevant.
Okay, so we've got the main eligibility criteria figured out. We know who's invited to the party. But now let's talk about how the guest list is actually put together. How do they decide which companies go into each specific index? Is there like a secret formula they use?
Well, it depends on the index. For the total market index, it's pretty straightforward. They include everyone who's eligible, and they weight them by their FMC. Remember that flow-adjusted market cap we talked about earlier?
Right, FMC. So for the total market index, it's all about being inclusive. But what about those more exclusive indices like the S&P 500, mid-cap 400, small-cap 600? How do they narrow down the field to those specific numbers? They're not just drawing names out of a hat, are they?
Definitely not. These indices have a fixed number of companies, and the index committee is heavily involved in picking who gets in. They're looking for companies that meet the criteria, of course, but also ones that will make the index well-balanced and representative.
So they're like the ultimate stock market talent scouts.
In a way, yeah. They're trying to build an index that reflects the overall makeup of the market. So if the technology sector makes up 30% of the market's total value, they'll aim for similar weighting in the S&P 500, for example. It's about creating a snapshot of that specific part of the market.
That makes sense. So it's not just about picking the biggest companies in each category. It's about making sure the index accurately represents the market as a whole.
Exactly. And just like the total market index, once they've chosen the companies, they weight them by FMC.
Now, you mentioned earlier there are also S&P composite indices. What are those all about?
Think of them as combinations of the main indices. The S&P Composite 1500, for instance, that brings together all the companies from the S&P 500, the mid-cap 400, and the small-cap 600. One-stop shop for investors who want exposure to a broad range of company sizes.
So instead of choosing between large cap, mid cap, or small cap, you can just get a taste of everything.
Exactly. And then you get the S&P 900, which combines the S&P 500 and the mid-cap 400, and the S&P 1000, which combines the mid-cap 400 and the small-cap 600. Each one gives you a slightly different view of the overall market.
Okay, so we've covered the main size-based indices and their composite cousins. But we can't forget about those intriguingly named top indices, the top 10, top 20, top 50. What makes them stand out?
Those focus on the top, the biggest players in the market. They track the companies with the largest float-adjusted market cap. Think of it as a way to follow the giants, see how they're performing as a group.
So if you think big companies are going to keep winning, those top indices could be a good way to play that trend.
Exactly. And they're pretty simple to understand. The top 10 index just takes the 10 largest companies in the S&P 500 by FMC. The top 20 takes the 20 largest, and so on.
So there's really an index for every type of investor and every approach, huh? If you want a broad view, you go for the total market index. If you like specific company sizes, there's the S&P 500, mid-cap 400, and small-cap 600. And if you want to focus on the heavy hitters, you've got those top indices.
And don't forget the S&P Completion Index, which tracks everything in the total market index that's not in the S&P 500.
Oh, right. It's like the index of the underdogs.
Exactly. Lots of ways to slice and dice the market.
So many options. But how do they actually calculate the value of these indices? I mean, I'm guessing it can't just be a simple average of all the stock prices, right?
You're right. It's a little more involved than that. S&P Dow Jones Indices uses something called the divisor methodology to calculate its indices.
Divisor methodology. Okay, I'm going to need a little help with that one.
Think of it like this. Imagine the index is a giant smoothie.
Okay, I like where this is going.
And the divisor's like the blender, making sure all the flavors are balanced. When one ingredient gets more expensive, the blender adjusts things so the smoothie still tastes the same.
So the divisor smooths things out, makes the index more stable so investors can actually use it as a reliable benchmark. Makes sense.
Exactly.
But the market's always changing, isn't it? Companies grow, they shrink, they merge, they spin off. How do the indices keep up with all that? Seems like it'd be a nightmare.
It takes a lot of work, for sure. That's where index maintenance comes in.
Yeah.
The indices are regularly updated and adjusted to make sure they're always accurately reflecting the market.
So they're constantly tweaking things, making sure the index stays relevant as the market changes around it. Pretty impressive.
And they have to deal with some tricky situations, too. Like what happens when a company is delisted from an exchange? If there's no price to go by, how do they remove it from the index? That's got to throw a wrench in the works.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, the document actually addresses that. In cases where there's no real market price for a stock that's being removed, they can take it out at a zero price, or a really small price. It's up to the index committee to decide.
The index committee, again, they really do seem to play a key role.
They do.
Okay. So it sounds like even in those unusual situations, there are systems in place to make sure the index stays on track. I think it's time we finally shed some light on this mysterious index committee. Who are these people, and what exactly do they do?
The Index Committee is a group of professionals from S&P Dow Jones Indices, and they're responsible for, well, maintaining the indices. They make the final calls on which companies are in and out, they review the methodology, and they adapt the indices as needed to make sure they're still doing their job. They're like the guardians of the indices, making sure everything stays on course.
Guardians of the indices, I like it. But the document says their discussions are secret. Why all the secrecy? Are they part of some secret society or something?
Maybe not a secret society, but there's a good reason for the secrecy. It's all about protecting the markets. The decisions they make can really affect stock prices, so if everyone knew what they were talking about, it could lead to market manipulation, people trying to take advantage. The secrecy is there to keep things fair.
Right, so they operate behind the scenes, but for a good reason, to keep the markets fair and transparent.
Exactly. Their role is crucial for making sure the indices stay objective and trustworthy.
Okay, so we've got a good handle on how these indices are built, how they're maintained, who's in charge. But where can our listeners go if they want to learn more? Where's all the data hiding?
The S&P Dow Jones Indices website is a great place to start. They have tons of information on their indices, all the historical data, the methodology documents, even FAQs. You can also find data from, quote, vendors like Bloomberg and Refinitiv.
And here's a key point. You can invest directly in an index. It's not like buying stock in a company. But there are lots of funds out there, like ETFs or exchange-traded funds, that try to track specific indices.
Right. Those funds basically try to mirror the performance of an index by holding a bunch of stocks that match the index's makeup. So if you wanted to invest in the S&P 500, you could buy shares of an S&P 500 ETF.
So you're essentially buying a slice of the index. That's a great way to diversify your portfolio and tap into a whole segment of the market. Okay, I think we've covered the basics of S&P US indices pretty well. We've gone from like index novices to having a decent understanding of what these indices are, how they're put together, and why they're so important. But there's always more to learn, right?
Oh, absolutely. We've just scratched the surface here. The world of S&P US indices is huge and super interesting. And in the next part, we're going to get into some specific examples of how these indices are constructed and weighted. You'll get an even deeper understanding of all the nuances and complexities.
Sounds good to me. Stay tuned, folks. Things are about to get even more fascinating.
Definitely. Okay, so let's get a little more hands-on, yeah. Let's look at how some of these indices are actually built, like in practice.
Sounds good to me.
The S&P Total Market Index, for example, that thing's massive.
Yeah.
It's got to be a beast to keep up to date.
It does sound like a pretty monumental task, keeping track of all those companies.
Well, the source document, it says they do a full reboot once a year. A complete reconstitution. They go through every single eligible security and rebuild the index from the ground up.
Wow, a total reset once a year? That's intense. But what about the rest of the year? Do they just ignore any new companies that pop up?
Nope, not at all. They actually rebalance things quarterly to keep it current. So during these rebalancings, they'll add any companies that became eligible, like maybe they went public recently or got listed on an eligible exchange.
Just a constantly moving target, huh? Always evolving to match the market.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process. And once they've got all their eligible companies for the total market index, then they weight them by their, you guessed it, float-adjusted market capitalization.
The FMC. Right. We promised we'd come back to that. Remind me again what that means. It's a bit of a mouthful.
Sure. It's all about how much of a company's stock is actually out there for public trading. Because the company might have millions of shares, right?
Right.
But some of them could be held by insiders or in restricted accounts. So you and I can't actually touch them.
So FMC is like a reality check on market cap. It's looking at the shares that regular investors can actually buy and sell.
Exactly. It gives you a much more accurate picture of a company's true market value.
Okay, so that's the total market index. It's like a giant mixing bowl of all the eligible companies. But what about the more exclusive indices, like the S&P 500, mid-cap 400, small-cap 600? How do they decide who gets into those? It's not just random chance, is it?
Oh, no, definitely not random. These indices have a set number of companies, and the index committee plays a big role in choosing which ones make the cut. They want companies that meet the criteria, obviously, but they also want to make sure the index is well-rounded, representative.
So they're like curators, picking and choosing to create the perfect collection.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They're aiming for balance,
Yeah.
making sure each sector is represented in the index in a way that reflects the overall market. So, like, if the tech sector makes up 30% of the market, they'll try to have a similar percentage of tech companies in the S&P 500.
So they're putting together a puzzle, basically, making sure all the pieces fit together to show a complete picture of the market.
Exactly. And just like with the total market index, once they've chosen the companies, they weight them by FMC.
Got it. Now, you mentioned these S&P composite indices earlier. What's the deal with those? Are they like super indices?
You could say that they're combinations of the main indices. So the S&P Composite 1500, for example, it includes all the companies from the S&P 500, the mid-cap 400, and the small-cap 600. Gives you a really broad exposure to companies of all sizes.
So it's like the all-you-can-eat buffet of the index world.
Yeah, something like that. And then you've got the S&P 900, which combines the S&P 500 and the mid-cap 400, and the S&P 1000, which combines the mid-cap 400 and the small-cap 600. They all give you a slightly different perspective on the market.
Okay, so we've covered the size-based indices and the composites, but we can't forget about those top indices, the top 10, top 20, top 50. They sound almost like the VIP section of the stock market.
They kind of are. Those are all about focusing on the biggest players in the market, the ones with the highest float-adjusted market cap.
So if you're a believer in too big to fail, those top indices are for you.
Basically, they're pretty straightforward, really. The top 10 index includes the 10 largest companies in the S&P 500 by FMC. The top 20 includes the 20 largest, and so on.
So it's really a choose-your-own-adventure when it comes to indices. You want the big picture. There's the total market index, interested in specific company sizes. There's the S&P 500, mid-cap 400, small-cap 600. Want to bet on the big guys? Check out the top indices.
And don't forget the S&P Completion Index, which tracks all the companies in the total market index that aren't in the S&P 500.
Right, the unsung heroes.
Exactly. Lots of different ways to slice and dice the market depending on your investment goals.
It's amazing how many options there are. But how do they actually calculate the value of these indices? I mean, it can't just be a simple average of all the stock prices involved, can it?
You're right. It's a little more complex than that.
Yeah.
S&P Dow Jones Indices uses something called the divisor methodology.
Divisor methodology. Okay, that one sounds kind of intimidating.
Well, imagine you're making a giant fruit salad.
Yeah.
Right? Each piece of fruit is like a company in the index, and the price of the fruit is like the stock price. Now, let's say the price of strawberries, one of your ingredients, suddenly goes through the roof.
Okay, I'm following.
If you kept adding strawberries to the salad based on their new higher price, the whole salad would just taste like strawberries.
Ah, I see where you're going with this. So the divisor is like a magical tool that adjusts the amount of each fruit in the salad, keeping the flavor balanced, even if the price of one fruit changes dramatically.
Exactly. The divisor is constantly working in the background, making sure the index value reflects the overall market movement, not just the ups and downs of individual stocks.
So it's like a smoothing mechanism, making the index more stable and reliable as a benchmark. Makes sense. But what about all the other changes that happen in the market? Companies merge, spin off parts of their business, get delisted from exchanges. How do the indices keep up with all that constant shuffling?
It's definitely a lot to manage. That's where index maintenance comes into play. They regularly update and adjust the indices to make sure they're always an accurate reflection of the market.
So it's like they're tending a garden, pruning and weeding and adding new plants to keep it healthy and thriving.
Exactly. They handle things like share issuances, stock splits, mergers, spin-offs. And we talked about how they deal with companies getting delisted, right? It's all about making sure the index stays reliable.
Right, so it's not just a set it and forget it kind of thing. There's a lot of active management involved. And of course, we can't forget about the index committee. They play a big role in all of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They're the ones making the final decisions about which companies are included, reviewing the methodology, and making those judgment calls in tricky situations.
Like those referees we talked about earlier. But their discussions are still secret, right?
That's right. Got to keep things fair and prevent anyone from getting an unfair advantage.
Okay, so we've got a good overview of how these indices are built, calculated, maintained. But there's always more to learn, isn't there?
Always. The world of indices is full of surprises. In the next section, we're going to dive into some of the more specialized indices, the ones that focus on specific niches and offer even more targeted investment opportunities.
Sounds good to me.
Cool.
Let's keep exploring this fascinating world of S&P US indices. Okay, so we've explored those core S&P US indices, but this document, it doesn't stop there. It takes us even deeper into some really interesting variations.
Oh yeah, there's a whole other layer to this.
Like, we've got the basic building blocks, and now we're going to see how they can be used to create even more specialized tools, indices that are like laser focused on specific investment needs.
It's pretty cool how many different ways you can slice and dice the market, you know?
Absolutely. So let's talk about select sector indices. The name kind of gives it away, right? These let investors zoom in on specific parts of the economy.
Exactly. If you're really into healthcare or you think energy is the future, you can use these indices to really hone in on those sectors, like having a magnifying glass for specific parts of the market.
So instead of just betting on the broad market, you can get really targeted with your investments.
Right. And there's a select sector index for every single one of the 11 GICS sectors.
ACS sector.
Yeah, that's the Global Industry Classification Standard. It basically categorizes companies based on what they do, their main business.
Ah, okay. So it's like a way of organizing the market into, I don't know, different buckets.
Yeah, exactly. You've got all the familiar sectors like
Yeah.
technology, financials, but also some that people might not think about as much, like materials, utilities. It's pretty comprehensive.
You've got a lot of choices.
You do. And they're put together in a pretty straightforward way. Like the Energy Select Sector Index, it just includes all the energy companies that are already in the S&P 500.
So you're not only choosing a sector, you're also kind of piggybacking on the reputation of the S&P 500.
Exactly. But here's where things get even more interesting. Remember we talked about market cap weighting, equal weighting?
Yeah.
Well, this document introduces another approach, capped market capitalization weighting. And it's in these select sector indices where that really comes into play.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Capped weighting, huh? So we've got market cap weighting, where the big companies have more sway, and equal weighting, where everyone's voice is the same. Capped weighting sounds like it's trying to find a middle ground.
You got it. Capped weighting, it's designed to limit how much influence those giant companies have, even within their own sector. It's like putting a speed limit on the stock market highway, preventing any one company from completely dominating the index, no matter how big it gets.
So even if a company is like the 800-pound gorilla in its sector, capped weighting makes sure it doesn't totally overshadow everyone else.
Exactly. And this capping thing, it's especially important for those select sector indices because some sectors are just naturally more concentrated than others. Like, think about technology. A few mega-cap companies make up a huge chunk of the entire sector's value.
Without capping, those tech giants would be playing with loaded dice, basically.
Right. Capped weighting makes sure the select sector indices give a more balanced view of each sector, even if there are a couple of huge companies driving things.
So it's like making sure everyone has a fair chance to contribute to the index's performance. The document gets into the weeds of how this capping works, and it's pretty technical. But the main point is that they rebalance the index regularly, adjusting the weights of the companies so no single company gets too big for its britches.
Yeah, it's all about keeping things balanced and making sure the index stays true to its goal.
So we've got capped weighting. Any other tricks up their sleeve with these select sector indices?
Oh, there are a few more. There are the S&P Select Sector Cap 20% indices, where, like the name says, no company can be more than 20% of the index's weight. It's like an even stricter limit on those larger companies.
So no matter how big they get, their influence is capped. Gotcha.
And then there are the S&P Select Sector Daily Capped 2520 indices. Those have even more specific rules about how much a company's weight can change day to day.
Wow, they really thought of everything. It's like a whole toolkit of options for investors.
And then you've got the S&P Select Sector 1560 capped indices. Those combine a cap on individual companies, a cap on the combined weight of like the top few companies.
So it's like setting limits at both the individual level and the group level, making extra sure things stay balanced.
Exactly. It adds another layer of nuance and balance to the index, preventing things from getting too concentrated in just a handful of companies.
It's really incredible how much detail goes into designing these indices. They're like finely tuned instruments, giving investors the most accurate and useful information possible.
It shows how important benchmarks are in investing. You know, these indices give us a shared language, a framework for understanding what's happening in the market. There's essential tools for anyone who wants to make sense of it all.
Whether you're a pro or just starting out, understanding these indices can really give you a leg up. It's like having a map to guide you through the jungle of the market.
Definitely. And it's not just about making money. It's about understanding the forces that shape the economy.
Yeah.
These indices offer a really unique perspective on that.
Well said. I think that about wraps up our deep dive into S&P US indices. We've covered a lot of ground, from the basic idea indices to the nitty-gritty details of how they're built and all the different variations they come in.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It has. And hopefully our listeners have a new appreciation for how complex and important these benchmarks are. They're truly essential tools for anyone who wants to understand and navigate the financial markets.
Absolutely.
And if you're hungry for more, we encourage you to check out the full methodology document. We'll put a link in the show notes.
Always good to go straight to the source.
Exactly. So keep those brains buzzing, folks, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.